Chapter 12. The seaweed thinned after only a few yards. We spotted the reef right away, a great colony of coral that must have been growing for many years. The pinks, greens, yellows, and oranges were as beautiful as any flower garden, the branching towers more intricate than any castle ever built. We passed sea fans like those that had decorated Coral's table, and fish so brilliantly colored they could rival the most exotic birds. More than once I noticed eyes watching us from holes and tails disappearing into crannies. The reef curved like the arc of a giant circle, seeming to go on forever, but we finally reached the gap that Coral had mentioned. A sunken island lay ahead, its base riddled with caves, its top worn away by the scouring waves. Even from a distance we could tell which cave was the largest, because the others were small nooks in comparison. Jagged rocks guarded both the ceiling and the floor of the wide entrance. Swimming toward the cave, we searched for some sign of the sea monster. There was nothing that might indicate that a monster lived there, no pile of bones, no scarring on the ocean floor, no ominous growl or glint of hungry eyes. Instead, yellow and turquoise fish darted through the entrance, flashing here and there as they changed direction. I followed Edric into the cave. The rocks were sharp, snagging on my skirt and tearing it. Smaller rocks, equally jagged and dangerous, protruded from the ground beside larger ones. I tried not to touch the floor, for it looked old, red, soft, and squishy, like a strange kind of coral that grew sideways rather than upwards. The cave was fairly large, nearly 12 feet across, but there was no sign of the pearl. There was a narrow opening at the back of the cave, however, and I had an awful feeling that that's where we needed to go. Edric agreed. "Let me go first," he said. "I've dealt with more monsters than you have." "What are you talking about? You don't know any more about sea monsters than I do." "Monsters are monsters, no matter where you find them." Edric peered into the opening and waved me back. "There's a passage here. You better stay behind me. It's so dark I can't see a thing." "Wait a minute. It's too cramped for a witch's light, but I have a candle I could use." Fumbling in my pouch, I took out the candle stub that Christina had given me. "Let me think about this for a minute. I've never tried to light a candle under water before." Since it was such an unusual situation, I was sure I had never read a spell that would fit. I concentrated, picturing what I wanted and trying to think of the words that would get it for me. Edric had started to fidget by the time I finally said, "Little candle burning bright, make day out of night. On the land or in the sea, keep your wick aflame for me." With a muffled hiss, the candle lit itself, although its light wasn't nearly as bright as it would have been on land. "Will this do?" I asked, handing it to Edric. "As long as it doesn't go out," he said. "Who knows what we'll find in here." I followed Edric closely, trying not to bump into him. Being near to him made me feel a little safer, although I was still so nervous that I jumped at the slightest thing. When a fish swam past and its tail brushed my cheek, I shrieked and grabbed Edric's arm, certain that the monster had found us. "What is it?" Edric asked, whirling around with a dagger in hand. I felt my face grow warm. "Nothing. Never mind, it was just a fish." "Huh," he grunted, shaking his head. Feeling like a fool who jumps on a chair when she sees a mouse, I resolved to be braver next time, no matter what I saw. As the passage narrowed even more, Edric's body blocked most of the light, but I could still see that the walls were ridged and kind of squishy. Something wasn't right. When the passage widened into a small chamber, Edric paused to look around. "Do you see anything?" he asked as he held the candle high. "I don't think I see a monster, but maybe I see the pearl. That thing is huge." "Let me look," I said, trying to swim past him. Caught in a swirl of seaweed on the floor of the chamber, the pearl was enormous. It was almost the same size as my head, yet perfectly round and pure white. Handing me the candle, Edric bent down and reached for the pearl. When he tried to pick it up, he couldn't budge it. "Something's holding it," he said. Edric braced himself to try again, and was able to lift the pearl a few inches. "Maybe if I help," I said, wrapping my arms around his waist and adding my strength to his. The pearl came away from the floor inch by inch, until whatever had been holding it suddenly let go, and we flew backwards, hitting the opposite wall with a splat. Slimy globs dripped from the pearl, coating Edric's hands. When we stood, we saw a depression where the pearl had been attached. Glistening with an oily sheen, a liquid heavier than water bubbled from the depression until it flowed onto the floor. I felt a tremor beneath my feet. "Edric?" I said, but he was too engrossed with the pearl to notice. Another tremor, stronger than the first, made Edric look up in surprise. "What was that?" demanded a familiar voice. I glanced down and saw the little green crab crawl out from the folds of my hem. "You forgot about me already, didn't you? I know it's because I'm so little. If I were as big as one of my brothers, you wouldn't forget that I was around. My brother Clausen." The next tremor was big enough to make me stagger. What are you waiting for? Asked the little crab. Get out of here while you still can. I'm a little dizzy, but it looks to me like those walls are moving. Edric, I said, we have to go. He put his hand on the small of my back and propelled me first through the passage. You first. With the little crab tickling my arm as he crawled into my sleeve, I dove toward the opening. We'd only gone a few feet when the walls pressed close enough to brush my shoulders, and Edric had to turn sideways to move at all. My heart was pounding, but I kept going, determined not to panic in front of Edric. The walls continued to close until they were squeezing me. Many years ago, one of the ghosts in the dungeon died by being buried alive under a collapsed wall, and he had described it to me in horrible detail. I had had nightmares about it for weeks, and I felt like I was living one of those nightmares right now. I squirmed and forced my way between the walls. The pressure would have been tremendous if the walls hadn't been so soft. I dug my fingers into their surface, dragging myself forward while they squeezed the breath out of me. Suddenly I reached the end, popping out of the passage like a seed from a grape. When I turned to help Edric, his arm and shoulder were already emerging, but the pearl was held in the crook of his arm and seemed to be in the way. I wrapped my fingers around the pearl and braced my feet against the wall. Tugging as hard as I could, I pulled the pearl free. A moment later, Edric slipped out. We were back in the larger cave, and all I wanted to do was leave, but I was horrified when I saw the opening had disappeared. The ceiling was lower, the jagged rocks now met, blocking our way. I set my feet down, but regretted it immediately, since the floor began to writhe and take shape beneath me. It wasn't a floor at all, but a giant pink, slug-like creature that rose up and slapped me against the back wall. Stunned, I drifted helplessly. When I opened my eyes, I saw Edric wrestling the monster in a dim half-light. I shuddered when something moved across my arm. It was Shelton, brandishing the fish-headed pin that he had pulled from my sleeve. What is he thinking? Grumbled the crab, waving his eye stalks at Edric. You can't fight a sea monster that way. Pushing away from me, the little crab swam toward the monster while holding the pin with his big front claw. Shouting, Leave him alone, you ruffian! He jabbed the pin into the fleshy slug. The slug retreated momentarily, then reared up again and slapped Edric, spinning him around until he slammed into the wall. I flailed my arms, trying to stay out of the monster's way. Take this! Yelled Shelton, plunging the pin into the slug again. A moment later, Edric had his dagger in hand and was slashing at the flapping, squirming monster. The candle was lost somewhere in the cave, but the rocks blocking the entrance allowed a small amount of light to enter. I was watching Edric and Shelton, wishing that I had a weapon as well, when I noticed that the monster always stayed in the front of the cave, making it more vulnerable to attack. It was almost as if it was anchored in place. I studied the monster, following its silhouette to the floor of the cave, and gasped. The monster was attached to the ground, but that wasn't all. Its soft pink body became the ground and led all the way back to... I couldn't believe how blind I'd been. If I hadn't been expecting to find a sea monster hiding in a cave, I might have realized the truth sooner. But to have gone so long without realizing... Edric, I shouted, that's not the sea monster. We're inside the sea monster. The thing you're fighting is its tongue. Its tongue? He shouted, backing away from droplets of the monster's blood as they formed a haze around his dagger. We have to get out of here. The monster's trying to push us back down its throat. It's trying to swallow us. The rocks must be its teeth. Shelton patted furiously toward me, grabbing hold of my shoulder. He wiggled his eye stalks and tickled my ear. We're in for it now, yelled Shelton. This reminds me of the time... Emma, said Edric, please do something about the crab before I forget how nice I'm supposed to be. I think we have something else to worry about right now, I said. Although the tongue had retreated under Edric's assault, its tip was probing the sides of the cave-like mouth. We tried to swim away, but it wouldn't be long before the tongue found us and pushed us back. The monster growled, a deafening sound that hurt my ears and shook me until my bones rattled, but I wasn't going to let it stop me. It was up to me to come up with a spell, whether Edric liked it or not. I evaded the tongue while I tried to think of the right words. Somehow, knowing what kind of creature we were dealing with made it a little less scary. All right, monster, I said at last, your people-eating days are over. Teach this monster, let him know that he cannot treat us so. Where his gums are strong and firm, make his teeth loose, make them squirm. Make them loose until they jiggle, make them looser till they wiggle. We're not killed while in our youth, make him lose each great big tooth. There was a crackling sound, and one by one the monster's oversized teeth became loose, although the smaller row beside it was untouched. It wasn't dramatic, but it was effective just the same. Now you've got it, shouted the crab. 2 more teeth wiggled in the monster's gums, tumbling to the floor of its mouth. As one tooth after another sagged and fell out of its jaw, the sea monster opened his mouth and howled. Propelled by a blast rushing through the monster's throat, we tumbled head over heels out of its mouth, past the coral reef, before hitting the ocean floor. I rolled to a stop yards away from Edric. Dizzy and shaken, I staggered to my feet and asked him, "Are you okay?" Edric rubbed his shoulder and winced. "Uh-huh. How about you? I thought you were too frightened to be much use in there, but you were actually pretty brave." "Not brave, just desperate." Edric shrugged. Sometimes there isn't much different between the two. "So how about a kiss? I think we should celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "After what we just went through? Being alive, for one. Getting the pearl, for another. What about your second successful spur-of-the-moment spell?" "I'll feel more like celebrating after we give this to Nastia Nautica and get hair from her," I said, tapping the pearl. Something tugged at my sleeve, and I looked down to see the little crab swinging from the fabric, his eye stalks crossed and his legs shaking. I dumped the pearl in Edric's lap. "How are you?" I asked the crab. When I realized that he was still holding the pin like a tiny sword, I took it away and tucked it in my pouch. "Nothing wrong with me," Shelton said as I set him more firmly on my shoulder. "I have felt better, though. Like just the other day, I was saying to my brother—" "Tell us later," Edric interrupted. "We'd better get moving. The monster could be anywhere. Look." He pointed back the way we had come from. The monster was gone, and I wondered what happened to it until I noticed a mottled gray shape curled between the sunken island and the coral reef. It had a blunt head, short grasping arms, a tall curving back fin, and a long pronged tail. Knowing the size of the head gave us a better idea of how big the sea monster really was. It was enormous and could easily have wrapped itself around Aunt Christina's tower. The creature moaned, a strange wavering sound that left my bones vibrating. Keeping near the ground in hope that we wouldn't be seen, Edric and I swam to the coral reef, staying as close to it as we dared. With the water growing dark around us, I knew that dusk was approaching and we had to hurry if we were going to get the pearl to the witch in time. Skirting the coral reef, we saw menacing shapes with curved fins and pointing faces circling overhead. Edric swam near me, his dagger in hand, his eyes moving constantly as he tried to keep watch in every direction. When we reached the deck, it was surprisingly quiet, with only the creaking of the timbers and the mysterious thuds and whistles that we always seem to hear in the ocean. Pearl greeted us at the door, while her mother, Nastia Nautica, remained in the high-backed chair facing the window in the stern. "We got it," said Edric, holding the pearl so the last of the light shone on its creamy surface. "Mother will be pleased," whispered Pearl. When Nastia Nautica neither turned around nor acknowledged us in any way, I began to wonder what was wrong. Gesturing to Edric to stay where he was, I swam around the side of the sea witch's chair and peered at her. She sat slumped in her seat with her head tilted back. Bubbles drifted from her open mouth, and I could see her eyes moving beneath their closed lids. "Is she okay?" I whispered to Pearl. "She's fine," said Pearl. "I sang her a lullaby and put her to sleep. She'll be furious when she wakes up, but by then you'll be long gone, and she won't have any power over you since you've accomplished the task." Edric looked appalled. "Why would you put your mother to sleep?" "You should be glad I did. She told me if you brought the pearl, she was going to have you steal the crown of the Sea Worm King. A ridiculous quest, since the crown is useless to anyone who isn't a worm. It's so typical of my mother. She's never been able to live up to her end of the bargain without adding other conditions. Mother used to tell my sisters and me that she'd give us a treat if we picked up our toys. Then when we did, she'd make us polish her barnacles or brush the shark's teeth before we saw any sort of treat. That's why my sisters, Clamella and Anemone, left home as soon as they were old enough. I'll probably join them one of these days." Pearl held out her hand, revealing a single strand of gossamer hair. "Here, I got the hair for you. I knew if you asked her for it, she'd never give it to you, even if you met all of her demands. You can't trust her at all. It's gotten so bad that everyone considers her the white cod of the family. I'm the only one who will even talk to her anymore." I tucked the hair in my pouch and was pulling the drawstring closed when I pricked my finger, drawing a bead of blood. It was the pin decorated with the ruby fish. Pearl deserved a gift for all she'd done, so I took it out and handed it to her. "This is for you. Thank you for the hair and for your help. I'm glad we didn't have to go on another errand. The last one was bad enough." "What a lovely pin," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I'm afraid it doesn't have any magic." "I have magic enough as it is. It will be a relief not to have to worry about what might happen when I'm wearing it." Edric was already backing toward the door. "I'm looking forward to going home. Ready, Emma?" "Aren't you forgetting something?" I asked. He had both arms wrapped around the pearl, and I think he was hoping that no one would notice. "Oh, right," he said, looking sheepish. "Here, Pearl, please give it to your mother." Pearl smiled and reached out her hands. "I'll make sure that she gets it."